The night was choked with sand and fury. Wind howled across the plains, scraping the wooden boards of John Baxter's ranch until they groaned like old timbers on a sinking ship. Dust seeped through every crack, carried by the storm that swallowed the horizon whole. Then 3 sharp knocks. Not timid, not hesitant. Desperate. John stiffened. He rarely had visitors, and no one in their right mind would be out in a storm like this. Lantern in hand, he unlatched the door. The wind tore it open, nearly ripping it from the hinges, and in the doorway stood a woman. Her face was pale beneath the grit, lips cracked, eyes wide with exhaustion. In her arms she clutched a small child, swaddled in rags, the little one's face pressed against her chest. The woman's knees buckled, and only the doorframe kept her upright. "Please," she rasped, voice drowned by the storm. Behind her, through the shifting curtain of dust, John caught sight of something that tightened his chest. Shadows. Horsemen. 3, maybe 4, their shapes cutting briefly through the storm before vanishing again. They were still far, but they were coming. The woman sagged forward, nearly collapsing into his arms. The child whimpered, and John Baxter, lonely rancher, a man who had tried for years to close his heart to the world, found himself standing on the edge of a choice he hadn't asked for. The storm outside still roared, but inside the Baxter ranch house there was silence. Silence so deep that it seemed to press against the walls. John Baxter set the lantern back on the table, the flame trembling in the draft. His calloused hand lingered on the handle as if it were an anchor, something steady to hold while the rest of his life threatened to pull loose. He had seen her face, the woman with the child. Her sudden appearance had opened a crack in the walls he had spent years building around himself. But before we can understand the weight of that knock on the door, we must understand what kind of life John Baxter lived until that night. John was a widower and not a fresh one. 5 years had passed since the day Mary, his wife, had coughed her last breath in the small upstairs bedroom. Consumption had wasted her body, but it was the silence after her passing that wasted John. He had buried her beneath a lone oak on the hill overlooking the north pasture. The tree still bent in the wind as if bowing to the grief that never left him. After Mary's death, something in John had hollowed out. His neighbors said he had become like a shadow, present but dim, alive but dulled. He did not laugh. He did not linger in town longer than it took to buy supplies. He did not sit with the men at the saloon or share stories by the stove in the general store. He worked, that was all. From sunrise until the shadows stretched across the grasslands. John plowed, mended, branded, and hauled. The land consumed him and he let it, because work left no room for memory. But there was Lily. His daughter was 10 now, with her mother's chestnut hair and his gray eyes. Lily had been only 5 when Mary passed. She remembered her mother's songs, the lullabies she hummed at the window, the way she braided Lily's hair with ribbons. Those memories clung to her, and John, though grateful, could not bear to speak of them. He felt that every word about Mary would tear the wound open again. So John raised Lily in silence. He taught her how to water the garden, how to feed the hens, how to ride the old bay mare. He kept her close, never far from the ranch. When other children in town invited her to birthdays or schoolhouse gatherings, John hesitated. Crowds carried sickness, he thought, and worse, they carried reminders of the life he no longer believed he could join. The house itself carried the echo of Mary's presence. In the parlor, the rocking chair still faced the window as it had when she embroidered by the fire. The scent of her lavender soap had long since faded, but John swore sometimes it lingered faintly in the curtains. He had left her Bible on the nightstand, its ribbon marker still holding the last psalm she had read aloud. Dust gathered on its cover. John dusted every surface of the house, but never that Bible. Every day passed much the same. John rose before dawn, lit the stove and set coffee to boil. Lily would shuffle in, hair tousled, rubbing her eyes. She would sit at the table while he laid down bread and butter. They rarely spoke in the mornings. The rhythm of chores dictated their words. Fences to mend, cattle to check, firewood to split. By evening, Lily would read from a primer by lamplight while John sharpened tools or repaired harnesses. Then they would sleep. This pattern, work, silence, work again, was how John chose to live. Not because he loved it, but because it kept him safe from hope. He had decided, after Mary's passing, that hope was a dangerous thing, could vanish overnight, as fragile as breath in a sickbed. Better to live without it. Better to stay alone, tucked behind the walls of his ranch, speaking only when necessary, praying only when Lily was not looking. Neighbors had long given up inviting him to gatherings. The women of Cedar Rock whispered about him at church. Such a shame, that handsome man locked in grief. Some said he needed a new wife. Others pitied Lily, growing up without a mother. John ignored them all. When sermons turned to family and community, John would bow his head and count the seconds until the words faded. He never sought change. His ranch was large, his house sturdy, his fields fruitful enough. He had no hunger for more. He kept the mansion standing but quiet, as if it were a shrine. Most of the rooms upstairs remained closed, curtains drawn tight. Lily's laughter sometimes bounced down the hallway, but John rarely allowed it to fill the whole house. He believed that joy, like fire, could spread too far and burn him alive with memories of what he had lost. And yet, beneath all his defenses, love still bound him, to Lily, to the land, to the memory of Mary. That love was quiet, restrained, almost invisible, but it pulsed steady. When Lily asked why he did not smile often, John told her, "Smiles are for when the work is done." She accepted it, though she smiled enough for them both. Years passed in this muted way. The ranch prospered modestly. Lily grew taller, braver. John's beard grayed early. He spoke little. He avoided entanglements. His world was ordered and closed, and he thought it would remain so until death. Until that night. The storm, the knock, the pale woman on his porch. Those things split his ordered life open like a log under an axe. As John stood in the doorway, watching her sway with the child in her arms, his mind flashed back to Mary's last moments, when she too had struggled for breath, when he too had been powerless to help. The old wound, the one he had sealed so carefully, bled fresh in that instant. But the truth of John Baxter's life before that night was this. He was a man who had surrendered to loneliness, a man who believed silence and labor were safer than connection, and a man who told himself, year after year, that all he wanted was for the world to leave him alone. And yet, the world had come knocking, literally. The woman did not collapse on his porch, though John half expected her to. She leaned against the doorframe, trembling, her thin frame shaking under the weight of both the storm and the child in her arms. The child stirred, coughed, and whimpered softly, burrowing deeper into the hollow of her shoulder. John said nothing at first. He was a man who measured words as carefully as he measured seed. But his eyes, sharp beneath heavy brows, studied her closely. She was no stranger to hardship. The cracked skin of her hands, the dust ingrained into her dress, the way she bent her body around the child like a shield. It all spoke of miles traveled and dangers endured. "Please," she whispered again, just a roof. For the night." Her voice was nearly drowned by the wail of the wind. John stepped aside without a word. The decision cost him something. He felt it like a shift in the air, like the creak of an old beam under weight. But he did it. She staggered inside, clutching the child, and he pulled the door shut against the storm. The sudden quiet of the house made her sway as though she had stepped into another world. John motioned toward the chair near the hearth. She sat carefully, as if afraid to break something, lowering the child onto her lap. The little girl's hair, pale gold beneath the dust, spilled across her mother's arm. John placed the lantern on the mantel and crouched to stoke the fire. Sparks leapt, caught, and soon flames licked at the logs. Warmth spread slowly through the room. He heard the woman's ragged breath ease as the chill lifted from her skin. When he finally turned to her, she lifted her eyes. They were a gray-green, sharp despite the exhaustion clouding them. She swallowed, gathering the strength to speak. "My name is Rose Miller," she said. Her voice was steadier now, though soft. "This here's Annie. My little girl." John gave a short nod. His silence pressed her to continue. "We've been walking 2 days. No wagon. No horse. Just our feet." She smoothed Annie's hair with a trembling hand. "We were with a wagon train heading west. But when trouble started, they left us behind. Said they couldn't carry more mouths. Said we'd slow 'em down." Her lips tightened. There was no self-pity in her tone, only a weary anger. "So we walked, hoping to find a ranch, a cabin, anyone. By God's grace, we found you before the storm took us." John's jaw tightened at the thought. He had heard of wagon trains leaving people behind. Harsh choices were made on the trail. Still, abandoning a woman and child on open prairie was cruelty that turned his stomach. Rose went on, as though afraid he might order her back into the night if she did not justify every breath. "We have nothing. No home, no money, no kin waiting. I ask for nothing but a corner in your barn for the night, just so Annie can rest." The child stirred again, small hands curling against her mother's dress. Rose bent low, pressing her cheek to the girl's hair, as though drawing strength from the contact. John's eyes flickered to Lily's small boots by the door. His daughter was asleep upstairs, unaware of the storm, unaware of the strangers now sharing their roof. His heart clenched with the thought of what danger might follow these two. The riders he had glimpsed in the storm, were they after her? But John did not ask. He only fetched a blanket from the chest near the wall and set it on the table beside her. He placed a tin cup of water there as well. "For the barn," he said flatly, his first words since opening the door. Rose nodded quickly, as if she had been handed gold. "Thank you." Her gratitude struck him harder than it should have. He cleared his throat and turned back to the fire. For a long while there was only the sound of wind outside and the crackle of flames inside. At length, Rose leaned back in the chair, eyes closing as her child's breathing steadied. John studied her profile in the firelight. The hollows of her cheeks spoke of hunger. The lines around her mouth told of burdens carried too long. Yet beneath it all there was a strength, a steel that reminded him of something he had once known. Mary's quiet resilience when the fields failed or sickness swept the town. He looked away sharply, angry with himself for the comparison. When Rose finally rose to her feet, Annie clutched in her arms. John led them silently to the barn. He laid the blanket across a stack of hay. The smell of horses and straw filled the air. Rose settled down gratefully, laying Annie in the nest of hay, wrapping her tight. She looked up once more at John. "God bless you," she whispered. He grunted, half turning before pausing. For a moment he stood there, the storm rattling the barn doors, the lantern casting long shadows across the rafters. Something in him wanted to ask, who were those riders? What had she fled? But he said nothing. He only turned and left, bolting the barn door behind him. That night, long after he had returned to his own bed, John lay awake listening to the groan of the wind and the faint sound of groaning from the barn. Rose's voice carried to him even through the storm, uneven, strained, the sounds of someone tormented in their sleep. John stared at the ceiling, fists clenched. For years he had ignored the cries of others. Neighbors with their troubles, drifters with their needs, the world with its constant begging for attention. He had chosen silence every time. But as he listened to the muffled sounds of suffering beyond his walls, something shifted inside him. For the first time since Mary's death, John Baxter considered stepping close to another person's pain. And with that thought, a story began that he could not have left alone, even if he tried. The storm passed with dawn. By the time the first strip of light broke over the prairie, the wind had calmed, and only thin veils of sand drifted along the fence lines. The Baxter ranch looked worn, its boards coated in dust, its corrals half buried. But it stood, as it always did, stubborn against the seasons. John Baxter rose before the rooster crowed. He moved through his morning motions in silence, kindling the stove, setting coffee to boil, breaking the brittle crust of yesterday's bread. Lily stirred upstairs, her small footsteps tapping on the boards above. It was an ordinary morning in every sense. except for the knowledge that two strangers now lay in his barn. He tried not to think about them. He told himself they would be gone with the sun high, walking again toward whatever horizon had abandoned them. But as he drank his coffee, staring into the black liquid, he could not push aside the memory of Rose's ragged breathing or the way her child had curled tight into her arms. He had heard them in the night. He had heard her groan in sleep, a sound that was not simply exhaustion but the echo of deeper wounds. When Lily came down, rubbing her eyes, John set her breakfast silently before her. She looked at him curiously. "Pa," she said softly. "I thought I heard voices last night." John's hand froze on the cup. He considered a lie, but Lily's gaze was steady. He had taught her to see truth in cattle prices, in weather signs, in the eyes of a horse. He could not teach her falsehood now. "There's a woman and a little one in the barn," he said at last. "Storm caught them on the road. They'll move on soon enough." Lily's eyes widened, and for the first time in months, real excitement lit her face. "A girl? My age." "Smaller," John said gruffly. 5, maybe 6. Lily pressed her lips together, holding back questions, but her eyes shone with curiosity. John felt the weight of it. He had given her so little company beyond his own. Perhaps he had been wrong to keep her world so narrow. Yet the thought of letting strangers closer to her tugged at his chest like a rusty nail. After breakfast, John went to the barn. He slid the door open slowly, letting the bright morning spill across the hay. Rose was already awake. She had smoothed her hair back with her fingers, though dust still clung to her dress. Annie lay curled under the blanket, sleeping soundly for the first time in days. Rose looked up at him. Her eyes were clearer now, though ringed with weariness. She rose quickly, as if expecting to be ordered away. "We'll be gone as soon as she wakes," she said. "Thank you for letting us stay the night. We won't trouble you longer." John studied her in silence. Her words carried pride, but he saw the truth beneath them. Her legs trembled as she stood. She had not eaten properly in days. Annie's small hand clutched the edge of the blanket as though afraid of losing even that. "You've got nowhere to go," John said flatly. Her chin lifted, stubborn. "We'll find somewhere." He glanced at the child. "Walking won't get you far." Rose's lips pressed thin. For a long moment, neither spoke. Dust motes swirled in the shaft of sunlight cutting through the barn boards. At last she dropped her gaze. "If you'd allow us to stay just until she's stronger, in the barn, not the house, I'll work for it. Can cook, mend, tend a garden. Whatever you ask." John's throat tightened. Something in her words struck deep. The quiet determination, the refusal to beg though she clearly had nothing. He thought of Mary in their first years of marriage, her hands raw from washing, her voice steady even when the winter winds tore through their walls. He exhaled slowly. "The barn's yours for now," he said. "Water in the pump. Blanket stays." Rose blinked, as though she had not expected even that much. She nodded quickly. "Thank you." John turned to leave, but Annie stirred then, sitting up with a small cry. Her eyes blinked wide, frightened by the unfamiliar place. Rose bent to comfort her, murmuring softly. John froze at the sound of the child's voice. It had been years since such a small voice had lived in his home. The sound pierced him in ways he had not prepared for. That night, after chores and supper, John lay awake again. He had thought silence was safety, but now the silence pressed too hard. He heard Rose's muffled groans again through the barn walls, broken sleep haunted by whatever she carried inside. He turned on his cot, fists clenched, until finally he rose, pulled on his boots, and lit the lantern. The barn door creaked softly as he entered. Rose lay curled near Annie, but her body twisted in restless dreams. A low moan escaped her throat, and she clutched at the hay as if it were dragging her under. John stood for a moment, uncertain. He had not stepped near another's grief in years. Yet he felt pulled, as though some old instinct, one he thought had died with Mary, had woken again. He set the lantern down and crouched near her, speaking low. "Rose, you're safe." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then slowly sharpened on him. For a moment she looked as though she did not believe where she was. She pressed a hand to her forehead, breathing hard. Annie shifted beside her, but did not wake. "Storm. I dreamed the storm again," she whispered. John said nothing. Words had never been his trade. Instead, he pulled the blanket higher over her shoulders. For the first time since Mary's death, he let himself stay near another's sorrow, not turning away, not walling himself in. Rose's breathing steadied. Her eyes closed again, softer now, as though his presence had given her a measure of peace. John sat there a long while, lantern flickering, until the weight of sleep pulled her fully under. When he returned to the house, he found Lily sitting on the stairs, clutching her small quilt. Her eyes searched his face. "Pa," she whispered. "Are they staying?" John hesitated. He wanted to say no. He wanted to promise it was only for a day, a night, a fleeting mercy. But the truth pressed against him, undeniable. "For a while," he said at last. Lily's face lit with quiet joy. She hugged the quilt close and hurried back upstairs. And John, standing in the hollow dark of the parlor, felt the walls he had built begin to shift. The days that followed settled into a rhythm John had not foreseen. Rose and Annie remained in the barn at first, but it wasn't long before Rose insisted on doing her part. She rose early, stoked the kitchen fire, kneaded bread with hands that trembled but did not falter. She patched Lily's worn dress with neat, practiced stitches. She hauled water from the pump, fed the hens, and carried herself with a quiet dignity that made John uneasy. He had expected her to be a burden. Instead, she became a presence that filled the hollow corners of the ranch. Annie, shy at first, soon warmed to Lily. The two girls ran through the pasture, their laughter rising above the wind. They made dolls from corn husks, built forts from hay bales, whispered secrets under the oak tree where Mary's grave lay. John watched from a distance, the sound of their joy cutting deep into his silence. It was painful and sweet all at once. Painful because it reminded him of what he had lost, sweet because it lit a corner of his world he had thought extinguished forever. Yet peace on the frontier is rarely more than a pause between storms. It was a Thursday when John rode into Cedar Rock for supplies. The town bustled with the usual life. Wagons rattling along Main Street, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, children darting past the saloon where piano music drifted into the sun. John hitched his horse outside the general store, hat pulled low, hoping to finish quickly and return home. He disliked the way people stared at him, half with pity, half with distance. But that day the stares seemed sharper. Whispers followed him as he walked. He heard fragments. Baxter's barn? Runaway? Child? He set his jaw and ignored them, though unease knotted in his chest. It was Sheriff Dugan who approached him outside the store, boots crunching on the dust. Dugan was a stout man, fair in judgment but cautious, his badge worn dull with years of service. He touched the brim of his hat. "John," he said evenly, "need a word with you." John's eyes narrowed. "What about?" "New man in town," the sheriff said. "Name's Samuel Crow. Says he's looking for his wife and child. Says they've been taken in at your place." The world seemed to tilt for a moment, though John's face betrayed nothing. "His wife?" he repeated, voice low. "That's his claim." Dugan studied him carefully. "He says Rose Miller is really Rose Crow. Says the girl Annie is his by blood. He's petitioning to take her back. Brought papers, too." John's jaw tightened. He thought of Rose's haunted eyes, her restless sleep, the way she never spoke of her past except in fragments. He had known there was more, something unspoken behind her silence. And now it stood in front of him, given a name. "Where is he?" John asked. Dugan jerked his head toward the saloon. "Making noise. Folks are listening." John did not go to the saloon. He finished his business in silence, loaded supplies, and rode home. But the unease followed him like a shadow. That evening, as Rose kneaded dough at the table, he finally spoke. "Samuel Crow's in Cedar Rock," he said. Her hands froze. The dough sagged between her fingers. For a moment she could not breathe. Then, quietly, "He found us." John studied her. "He says you're his wife." Rose's face tightened, fury and fear warring in her eyes. "Once," she said, voice sharp, "but I left. He—" She stopped, swallowed. "He was cruel, Mr. Baxter. To me, to Annie. A man who drank more than he worked, who raised his fists more than his voice. I walked away when I couldn't bear another day. If he calls that desertion, let him. But I will not hand Annie back to him. Not while I breathe." Her words struck like hammer blows, full of raw truth. John felt a slow burn rise in his chest. He had suspected something, but to hear it laid bare made his blood heat. "He's talking to the sheriff," John said. Rose's eyes widened. "The law? Will they force me?" John's silence was answer enough. On the frontier, law was as much about reputation as it was about papers. If Samuel Crow swayed enough voices, the sheriff's hand would be tied. That night, Rose wept softly in the barn, though she tried to hide it. John heard her through the boards. Annie clung to her mother, frightened by what she did not understand. Lily asked no questions, but her eyes were full of worry. Within days, the town's whispers grew louder. Men at the general store muttered that Baxter had taken in another man's wife. Women at church shook their heads, saying it was scandalous. Children whispered to Lily at school that Annie wasn't really her friend, just a runaway. The air around the Baxter ranch thickened with suspicion. And then Samuel Crow came himself. It was a Sunday afternoon when John saw the dust cloud on the road. For riders approached, Crow at the front. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face hardened by liquor and arrogance. A scar cut across his chin. He rode like a man who believed the land belonged to him. He reined up at the gate, voice booming. "Rose, Annie, come out now. You're mine by law, and no rancher's charity will change that." Rose froze inside the house, Annie clutching her skirts. Lily clung to John's arm. John stepped onto the porch, shotgun cradled though not raised. "This is my land," John said evenly. Crow sneered. "And that's my wife in your house. My daughter too. You're hiding them. Whole town knows it." John's eyes burned, but his voice stayed steady. "They're safe here." "Safe?" Crow barked a laugh. "You think you can keep them? The sheriff'll see papers. Courts'll see sense. You'll lose Baxter. Better hand them over now before you're branded a thief of another man's family." Rose's breath hitched behind the door. Annie whimpered. Lily pressed closer to John. He stood there, the weight of choice pressing harder than any he had borne since Mary's death. He could step aside, retreat into silence, let the law or what passed for law decide. It would be easier, safer. The world had told him to stay alone for years, and this was his chance to obey. But something in him had shifted. He had heard Rose's cries, seen her strength, watched Annie's laughter mingle with Lily's. Silence no longer felt like safety, it felt like surrender. John Baxter's world was no longer his alone. The Cedar Rock Square was alive with murmurs and shifting feet. Farmers, shopkeepers, and children clustered along the edge of the dusty plaza, their eyes flicking between John Baxter and Samuel Crow. The wind carried more than dust this time. It carried tension, anticipation, and the scent of justice, or what the townspeople thought justice should be. Crow stood tall, chest forward, boots planted as if daring the entire world to contradict him. He gestured toward Rose and Annie, standing behind John near the porch steps. "These are mine. Law gives me claim. She is my wife, this girl my daughter. Hand them over." A ripple ran through the crowd. Whispered judgments mixed with gossip. "Baxter has sheltered a runaway woman. The law is on Crow's side. Who will speak for the girl?" John took a step forward, boots scuffing the sand. His gaze swept the square, resting briefly on each face, reading them as he had learned to read the plains. There was curiosity, fear, doubt, and in a few, a flicker of recognition. They had seen him work his land, care for Lily, nurse her through fever, and defend the farm from rustlers. These faces knew he was capable of action when action was needed. "Stop!" His voice carried. It was calm, but carried authority, honed through years of commanding fields and livestock. The crowd stilled, dust rising from their feet like a ghostly halo. "I'll speak plain." John's eyes fixed on Crow. "You claim this woman is your wife and this child your daughter. That is your story. But the truth is different." Crow's brow furrowed, lips twitching. "And who will decide the truth? The court? The sheriff?" John glanced at Sheriff Dugan. The sheriff stood beside him now, silent, but his presence lent weight to John's words. John continued, "Annie would have died in the prairie without care. Fever had her in its grip. I watched her struggle, saw her small body burn with heat. Rose Miller stayed by her side, fought to save her. She worked these lands, fed my animals, mended fences, carried more than any stranger should. And you," John said, turning his gaze to Crow, "you abandoned her, left them to wander alone. If anyone has claim, it is she who protected the child, not you who walked away." The crowd shifted again, some nodding, some murmuring their surprise. Crow's sneer faltered, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across his scarred face. Rose's hands shook slightly, but she did not retreat. She looked at John with eyes wide, as if he had lifted a weight she had carried alone for too long. Annie clutched her skirts, peeking out with curiosity, sensing the shift in the air. Lily held John's hand tightly, her small fingers entwined with his, drawing courage from his calm. Crow opened his mouth, but words failed. The sheriff stepped forward then, voice low but firm. "Baxter is right. These children are safe here. He has acted to protect them. No court will punish him for what is plainly right." A murmur of agreement swept through the square. The townspeople had watched John Baxter act without thought of glory, for nothing more than the well-being of a child and the honor of a woman wronged. Crow's threats dissolved in the sun-baked dust. His voice, once booming, fell into near silence. "You," Crow began, then stopped. Humiliation darkened his features as he turned, muttering curses under his breath, mounting his horse. The riders behind him followed quietly. Within moments, they vanished into the horizon, leaving a trail of dust that slowly settled. The square emptied. Curiosity and judgment melted into whispers of respect. People had witnessed a man choose justice and compassion over ease and fear. They remembered his deeds. How he had saved Annie from fever, how he had fed the hungry, how Rose had worked the farm tirelessly by his side. The tale would be told in the town for years, a story of courage unspoken until now. John stood near the porch, watching the dust settle. Rose came forward slowly, Annie in her arms, eyes downcast but calm. Lily released his hand and ran to Annie, taking her small hand. For a moment, the three children, one who belonged to John, one to Rose, stood together, innocence reclaiming the space once threatened by fear and cruelty. John stepped closer to Rose. He had not spoken since confronting Crow. The words he now offered were simple but heavy with meaning. "It's done," he said. "They are safe. You are safe." Rose's eyes lifted to meet his, and for the first time in many months, perhaps years, she allowed herself to breathe freely. The tension in her shoulders loosened, and a faint, weary smile touched her lips. John watched her for a moment longer, then turned to check on Annie. He knelt, brushing a streak of dust from her cheek. Lily joined him, leaning close. The girls whispered and laughed softly, forming bonds that only trials could forge. The sheriff nodded at John quietly before mounting his horse to leave. There was no need for further words. Justice, the way it had been enacted here, required no proclamation. The threat had vanished, the humiliation belonged to Crow alone, and the quiet authority of a man who did what was right had prevailed. For the first time in years, John Baxter allowed himself to feel the stirrings of something he had long kept buried. Hope, not a fleeting spark, but something steadier, built from action and care. He realized that involvement in another's suffering did not weaken him. It had awakened a part of himself he thought lost forever. As the sun dipped behind the cedar trees on the far edge of the plains, John stood with Rose and the children, the porch of his home framing the tableau. Dusty boots, hay-strewn skirts, and sunlight played over their faces. For the first time since Mary's passing, he felt that his world had room for more than labor and grief. It had room for life. Evening draped itself over the Baxter Ranch like a slow, golden curtain. The sky burned orange and red where the last rays of sun hit the horizon, and the wind had softened into a gentle whisper through the cedar trees. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the soft hum of chores finished and the distant murmur of children playing in the barnyard. John Baxter stood on the porch, boots dusty, hands rough, eyes tracing the outline of the fields that had been his world for decades. He thought of the past days. The storm, the desperate knock, Rose's arrival, Samuel Crow's threats, the confrontation in Cedar Rock Square. Everything had passed, and yet the world felt new, like a book whose pages had been turned too quickly, only to reveal a story that had always been waiting. John reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it carefully and held it in his palm. The cedar ring he had carved long ago, its surface smooth from hours of patient labor, held the scent of sawdust and earth. He had not intended it for anyone. It had been a token of promise, a relic of hope he had never dared to offer. Yet now, as the wind carried the laughter of two small girls across the yard, he knew it belonged to Rose. He stepped toward the barn, the soft boards creaking beneath his weight. The children's laughter softened as they noticed him. Lily ran to his side, holding Annie's small hand. They looked up at him with innocent anticipation. He nodded toward the barn door, and the girls moved inside, leaving him standing with Rose, who was tending a small fire he had built near the doorway. Her hair caught the last sunlight, glinting like copper threads against the fading sky. John cleared his throat. "Rose," he said, his voice low but steady. She looked up, eyes wary, as though expecting reproach or hesitation. He shook his head slightly, offering a small, honest smile. "I carved this a long time ago, for someone I hoped I might trust, someone I hoped might walk into my life when I thought it was done. I never gave it to anyone, until now." He extended his hand, palm up, and placed the cedar ring there. Rose stared at it, then at him. The silence between them was heavy, laden with the weight of everything unspoken. The nights of wandering through dust, the terror of Crow's return, the quiet moments of care, and the shared labor that had bound them in ways neither could deny. She lifted the ring, turning it over in her fingers. The firelight danced across the polished cedar, highlighting its subtle curves. Her lips parted slightly, but she did not speak immediately. Her eyes glistened with moisture, reflecting both relief and disbelief. Finally, after a long pause, she pressed it to her palm, closing her fingers around it. A smile broke across her face then, faint at first, uncertain, and yet genuine. It was the first true smile she had allowed herself in months, maybe years. Annie's small voice called from inside the barn, and Lily tugged at her skirt, urging her to join their play. Rose looked at John once more, the ring secure in her hand, and nodded. A silent agreement passed between them, heavier than words. Trust, protection, and perhaps, in time, something stronger. John watched as the girls ran across the yard, their laughter mingling, echoing, bouncing off the barn walls and into the evening air. For a long moment, he allowed himself to feel the fullness of the scene. Children, safe and warm. A woman who had endured fear and hardship, now at peace. A rancher who had stepped into a story he had not chosen but could no longer leave. His heart, long buried under grief and solitude, beat steady, warm, alive. He felt the land around him, the same earth he had plowed and cared for over decades, as if it too had approved of this new chapter. The scent of cedar, straw, and smoke wrapped around him like an embrace, and for the first time, the ranch did not feel like a place of isolation. Felt like home. The sun dipped fully below the horizon, leaving streaks of violet and silver across the sky. Fireflies began to dance over the fields, tiny sparks of life, unnoticed until you looked closely. John felt the weight of silence once more, But this time it was comforting, not oppressive. He lowered himself onto the porch step, watching the girls, the fire, the barn, and the fading light. Rose came beside him, her hands resting lightly on the railing. She did not speak. Words were unnecessary. The cedar ring gleamed faintly in the last light, a symbol of beginnings born from dust, struggle, and quiet courage. Together, they watched as the world around them softened into night, a world that, though harsh and unforgiving, now held room for something new. A family formed not by convenience, but by choice, care, and courage. And so the Baxter Ranch, once a place of grief and solitude, now held laughter and promise. The wind rustled through the cedar trees, carrying with it whispers of life renewed. The stars began to pierce the darkening sky, each one a witness to the quiet triumphs, the survival of hope, and the beginnings of love carefully nurtured in the shadow of past hardships. John placed his hand lightly on Rose's shoulder. She wandered with her child through the dust, he said softly, voice carrying the weight of the story, until a silent rancher offered a home and an offer. Rose looked at him, eyes shimmering in the firelight, and for a long moment did not answer. Then she turned her gaze to the stars, a gentle smile forming, as if understanding that the journey had not ended in despair, but in a new kind of beginning. The children's laughter carried into the night. The barn doors were open now, letting the cool evening air mix with the warm glow of lantern light. In that quiet, John felt a sense of completion. Not closure, not finality. There was still work, still care to be done. But a harmony, delicate yet steadfast, had grown from shared hardship and compassion. Here, in the quiet of the Texas plains, a new family had taken root. The echoes of the past remained, the memory of loss never fully gone, but a future stretched ahead, filled with possibility, laughter, and quiet love. And for John Baxter, for Rose, for Annie, and for Lily, that was more than enough.